afternoon. It is my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the faculty and the academic officers of the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University to the 27th Annual Peace Studies Conference. The theme this year, as you know, is Lighting the Darkness, Exploring Alternatives to Violence. It's a great honor to be here to welcome you, in part because this begins the inauguration events also, and this is a theme closely related to that. In the study of ancient manuscripts, there's a tradition, when faced with more than one variant, of preferring the more complicated. This relies upon an assumption that human communities tend to prefer simplification. And so scholarly practice of any kind, can provide some resistance to that temptation to conclude simply. And as we prepare to listen to the speakers and engage in conversation today, I'm drawing a comparison with violence, which sometimes can seem like the easiest, most simple, most direct response to the issues that divide us. And so this workshop today provides opportunities for us to learn skills, build confidence, understand in a more nuanced way the complexities, and to grapple with the complexities. So again, welcome.
Thanks, Karen. For those of you who may not know her, she's our dean, Karen Erickson, our new academic dean this year. I'm Kelly Kramer. I'm the chair of the Peace Studies Department at St. Ben's and St. John's. I'm very short, so I'm going to do this. And I'd like to welcome all of you on behalf of our department to our 27th Annual Peace Studies Conference. That number still blows my mind. Our theme this year, Karen has already explained to you, and we've got a very exciting schedule for you today. In addition to our opening address by Mel Duncan, who I'll tell you about in just a minute, at 3 o'clock we'll be screening the documentary film, The Little Town of Bethlehem, examining nonviolent action in the Palestinian territories. And tonight at 7 o'clock we'll host the kickoff event for CSB's presidential inauguration, welcoming President Mary Hinton to our campus. And our keynote speaker, Dr. Erica Chenoweth, will discuss her award-winning paradigm-shifting research on why civil resistance works. You don't want to miss this, folks. It's really interesting stuff. And this whole conference today has kind of been my dream for about 3 years to have the two of them as our speakers, so I'm really excited. I do want to take a minute to thank this year's conference sponsors, CSB President Mary Hinton, Professor Matt Lindstrom and the McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civil Engagement, Professor Nick Hayes and the Chair of Critical Thinking, and Professor Gary Prevost and the Global Awareness Lecture Series. It took a lot of people to help us pull this off. And I also wanted to make special mention that our annual conference would never have been possible, none of these 27 years or so, without the generosity of Robert and Lorraine Breitenbucher, who provided the funds that have allowed us to hold this event every year for more than a quarter of a century. Robert passed away in 2004, and sadly, Lorraine died just last month. But the family's generosity continued as mourners were asked to donate to our conference fund in Lorraine's honor. We're very grateful and humbled by the Breitenbucher's support, and hope that today's conference and those to come in future years will continue to fulfill their vision. That said, I'm really excited to be able to introduce our opening speaker. Mel Duncan is the co-founder and the past executive director of Nonviolent Peaceforce, which he currently serves as director of special projects. A graduate of Macalester College in St. Paul, his biography reflects his work on a wide variety of issues, and I found this really interesting, including peace in Central America, living wages, peace conversion of weapons industries, corporate welfare reform, nonviolent conflict resolution, opposition to nuclear waste storage in environmentally and culturally sensitive areas, and, last but not least, opposition to public financing of a baseball stadium. He also worked on Paul Wellstone's U.S. Senate campaign in 1990, and he traveled to Iraq with medical supplies before the start of the most recent war in 2003. Given that track record, he's won a variety of awards for his work, and I was very happy to learn recently through reading a Nonviolent Peaceforce newsletter that he will be receiving the honorary award for 2014 from the Vincent L. Hawkinson Foundation for Peace and Justice, right here in our own Minneapolis. At the Hague Appeal for Peace Conference in 1999, Mr. Duncan met David Hartzell, am I saying his name correctly? And the two of them together began to work to launch Nonviolent Peaceforce. So I'm thrilled to have him here today to tell you all about the work that they do. So please welcome with me Mel Duncan.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you everyone for being here. Such a beautiful early fall afternoon. I want to share with you some deep pain and some deeper hope. In terms of where we are today, we are in a situation where more civilians are at severe peril than any other time since World War II. And indeed, those situations are getting worse. So we'll go into that in a minute. But I'm also very aware that this afternoon, in fact, probably while we're gathered here, there's going to be a key vote in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. regarding further military action in Syria and Iraq. So we're going to start out doing a couple of exercises for two reasons: to engage people, but also for you to sit and listen to me for an hour and a half would be death-defying. I mean, it's way too much to ask of you and me. And so what we're going to start out with is an exercise called the human thermometer. We've done this when we bring our civilian peacekeepers together for their mission preparedness training. We always do this first thing, first day with people, so you can imagine this exercise taking place in a very rural, remote area of South Sudan with people doing the same thing you're about to do. Has anybody ever done the human thermometer before? It's literally to take the temperature of the group. And so what we're going to do, can we get a couple more computers up here? No, I mean, it wasn't long ago that we just spoke like this, right? Yeah. So you'll have to get up from your chairs and move around. And what I want you to think about is that this wall, it means you strongly agree. This wall means you strongly disagree. So you're going to see a statement. The only reasonable choice for dealing with ISIS is to further train and arm the moderate opposition in Syria and bomb Iraq and Syria. And so place yourself along the spectrum. If you're over here against the wall, you strongly agree. If you're over here against this wall, you strongly disagree. And believe me, I'm not looking for right answers here. Then you can place yourself right where you're at. You stay right along against a continuum. Oh my. This is an interesting spread, and so let's just get some, we'll use this. So what caused you to stand in the middle?
I have no idea. I don't know a lot about it, but it's not the only option. Like, it's not the only reasonable choice. For sure, there's definitely other things that are better. But
Okay. All right. And you back here. You're kind of over towards agree.
I don't know all the details about everything enough to make an informed decision. I don't think any of us really honestly know all the details. It's definitely an option. There's obviously other ways we can do it, and that's fine in the middle, not too far left. But that's my opinion.
Okay, good. And let's come over here, and let me by here to the wall, to the strongly disagree folks. And You were right against the wall.
Yes.
What caused you to place yourself there?
Taking lives is not something that should be considered lightly.
Okay, all right. And how about you?
Oh, I was meant to stand in the middle.
Oh, you wanted to go. Go ahead. You can move if you change your mind while you're standing, feel free to move. Okay. I can see all the people looking away from you right now. Don't look at me. All right. And I won't look at you. I'm going to sneak up on you. What caused you to?
The same reason someone else said. I don't think you need to take lives to have a solution.
Okay. So we're getting some of the sacredness of lives coming through here. And let me just come through this way. Excuse me. And how about you? Don't laugh, I'll pick you.
I mean, I just agree with what the other two people were saying, that there's never, or that violence is never has to be the option, so we can look to other alternatives.
To other alternatives. Okay. And let's do one more, somebody who's over here. How about you? What caused you to be a little bit away from the wall, but still more on the disagree side?
I think that I don't see options yet, and I think that really is important in terms of nonviolent resistance, that we find other options to deal with this. I think I'd be completely against the wall in terms of my commitment to pacifism, but I think we need to come up with other ways of dealing with this so that we're just not against.
Okay. All right. So we need positive alternatives. So let's go to the next statement. Now, how many of you are sophomores? Juniors? Seniors? Freshmen? Okay. So from the time you were in early grade school, our country's been at war. Very long period. So, my country will be at war throughout my lifetime. Strongly agree, strongly disagree. Put yourself along the spectrum.
Do you have room for gaps?
Yes, you can place yourself any...
No, gaps in terms of my...
No, this is continuous for the rest of your lifetime. Yes. You strongly agree on this side, strongly disagree over here. Okay. Look at this. You know, look at the spread here. Look at how we're... Yeah, isn't that interesting? Look at the demographics. We're looking at human demographics at this moment. And see how it's spread? So let's start over here. The people who strongly disagree that my country will be at war for the rest of my lifetime.
Well, given my age, that would be reasonable. We've been doing this for a long time without much success. I anticipate if the President and the Congress go ahead, we'll be at it for another 20 years.
Okay. And let's get one more over here in terms of strongly disagree.
Well, I've already lived in a period of time where we did have some peace and no more, so I automatically, because of my age.
Okay. And can we have that again?
My age, or it's my birthday yet.
Oh.
No, I believe that because of my age, we did experience a period of peacetime, which was wonderful. I got to grow up in that, and so I feel blessed with that.
And you guys didn't get to grow up. Okay, let's go over to the middle part here. Ireland. You're in the middle. What caused you to place yourself there?
Well, I kind of feel like we will be, but I have a strong hope that we won't be as well.
So the hope and the realism. Yeah. Okay. And how about you? You're right in the middle.
I'm not really sure, but it's kind of part of the future, and I don't really want to determine whether we are or not. And I don't know how long I'll be living for, so I'm not gonna, I'm just in the middle because I'm not sure.
Okay. A lot of uncertainty. Okay. And let's go over here. You're kind of getting to the point of agreeing that my country will be at war throughout my lifetime?
Well, I've grown up with the way we resolve conflicts is through violence, so it's just sort of assume that it will continue to be that way.
And how about you?
Well, given my age, I should be at the end of the law, but I think people in this country are tired of war and have come to the realization that we have to do something different. Representative Waltz stood in a store a couple of years ago, asked for people's input on bombing Syria and St. Peter, Minnesota, and this was scheduled for an hour, and he had to extend it for a half hour because the line was so long, and 100% of the people that showed up to speak to him were opposed to any further war in Syria.
Okay, interesting. Let's come over here, though, to people who strongly agree that my country will be at war throughout my lifetime. What caused you to be all the way over on this? Strongly agree.
I don't know.
Okay, just a hunch.
I guess a hunch.
All right. How about you?
Well, I'm 21, so we've been in war for like more than half my life. I don't see us stopping because there's too much profit motive in it. So I say continue far into the future.
It's an important statement for those of us who are elders to keep in mind. Thank you. And how about you? You strongly agree.
Well, I agree with the profit-motivated part, but I think America is an egocentric country. We always consider violence. It's always part of the option, and there's always going to be someone pushing for it.
Okay. All right. Let's do one more. Well-trained, unarmed civilians can effectively protect civilians in the midst of violent conflict. Well-trained, unarmed civilians can effectively protect civilians in the midst of violent conflict. If you strongly agree, you're over here. If you strongly disagree, you're on that wall, or you're someplace on the continuum in between.
Some of the answers are kind of similar to Peace Studies 101 and 2. I just don't know. I feel the same. No, it's just one of you did
Okay. So we've got someone right in the middle here. Oh, you're... oh, all right. All right. What caused you to be in the middle?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like sometimes people who are like unarmed can have an effect on people, especially if they're well trained. But there's other times when, like, if someone's gonna uprise and whatever, they're not gonna listen to somebody who's armed. So.
Okay. So it works sometimes. All right. And Merle, you're over kinda on the agree side. What caused you to be 2/3 of the way?
Well, maybe you should be over there. I think you proved it by the groups that have acted with you in terms of nonviolent resistance. And people survive, and sometimes conflicts get resolved. Nonviolent.
Okay. Now we have no one strongly disagreeing. Isn't that interesting? You're over here kinda on the disagree side. What caused you to go over there?
I guess I didn't really understand what well-trained meant, and being that it's a violent conflict, and well-trained means that you could be helping someone out, but what if you're getting shot at? I don't know what that would, how you'd be able to help.
How would you when you're against armed rebels that are shooting at you? Hopefully you'll learn something about that in the next hour. And let's go all the way over to this side. You're close to the one in most disagreement. What caused you to place yourself there?
Similar to what he said, I was thinking like well-trained against like people with guns, and I just thought like they might have a better chance than people who weren't well-trained, but at the same time, if other people have guns and are like trying to use them, you don't have much of a chance.
All right, okay. Well, thank you. Why don't you just grab a seat wherever you want? It's really with great humility that I talk to you today about the protection of civilians. This has been an excruciating couple of months. When you look at the slaughter of civilians in the Central African Republic, the targeted gang rapes of women in South Sudan, the shooting down of civilian airliners, the thousands of rockets aimed at civilians in areas launched from Gaza into Israel, and then the disproportionate response from Israel that killed over 2,000 people, the vast majority of whom have been civilians. You know, I spend a lot of time working at the UN, and I was there the morning that the school had been shelled in Gaza by Israeli artillery. Not precision weapons, whatever that modifier means, but by artillery. And women and children and men were killed as they slept. And during the head of the UN mission from Palestine got up that morning and said, "The world stands disgraced." And those 4 words I've not been able to shake. The world stands disgraced. Disgraced. What does that mean? Are we at that period in our lives where the value of the human life, and that came up, I was impressed in a number of your answers, the value of human life has gotten to the point where grace has left us? We witnessed in the last couple of weeks the re-escalation of the war in Iraq, where there are people at this point who are fleeing Iraq into Syria, which gives you some perspective. Syria, where over 200,000 people have already been killed, where there are over 1,000 armed opposition for groups fighting the government and fighting each other, often fighting with weapons that they've either been directly supplied or have confiscated that originated from the U.S. In the last month, we witnessed Ferguson and again saw how racism lurks within our culture, within our national psyche. And we saw the response from the police forces that responded as military units, because $4.3 billion worth of weapons that were manufactured, that were profited for use in Iraq and Afghanistan have now been given to our police forces throughout the United States. $4.3 billion. If we had 10% of that to work on nonviolent peacekeeping, what a different world this would be. Royalton has grenade launchers. Their police force has grenade launchers. St. Cloud has armored personnel carriers that can withstand mine explosions. The militarization of the world, the degrading of civilians. And finally, the YouTube executions that this modern world has given us. And I say that with a great deal of pain, because David Haynes, who was executed on Saturday, had been one of Nonviolent Peaceforce's peacekeepers in South Sudan and had served us in 2012 and then went on to work with another group in Syria where he was abducted and then executed on Saturday. So I have a fear right now that the thin membrane that of global norms and conventions, of behaviors that has protected civilians, albeit unevenly and inconsistently, but still has been there, that membrane is being shredded. And it's not only being shredded by jihadists and warlords, It's being shredded by elected prime ministers and elected presidents. So, what am I doing here with you today besides depressing you in the first few moments? What I'd like to talk to you about is one means of response. Not the only response, but one means of responding constructively and nonviolently that has been shown to work in a variety of situations. So going over what is the need, which I've already done, but I'll go into a little more depth. What is unarmed civilian peacekeeping? Does it work? Why? And then what you can do. But my most important goal here, to paraphrase Jean-Paul Lederach, is to spark your moral imaginations. To let you imagine that the next time you hear, you know, we would like to do something else, but this is our only option. To always then engage your imagination, that there are other options. And that came up a couple of times during the exercise. What are other options? Diane DePrima, in a wonderful poem called Rant, says, "The only war that matters is the war against the imagination." The only war that matters is the war against the imagination. The only war that matters is the war against the imagination. All other wars are subsumed by it. So in terms of the need, the World Development Report found that 1.5 billion of us are living in areas where there is repeated violence. They also found that not one of those countries will have achieved a single Millennium Development Goal, the 8 basic goals of standard of living, education for girls and women, basic kinds of caloric intake, basic standards that were set by the UN as the bottom, that all countries should have this by 2015. Not one country that is experiencing repeated violence will achieve one of the 8 by 2015. And the vast majority of victims of violent conflict are civilians. And this is not an accident. This is not collateral damage. This is done as a matter of strategy, more often than not. Jan Egeland from the Norwegian Refugee Council recently said that the forced displacement of people, and we hear this all the time. We hear Syria now, there's 9 million people who have been displaced. That the average amount of time people worldwide are living in displacement is now 17 years. So if people start to flee, this is not just a casual, we're going to go stay with the neighbors for a few days. And he goes on to say that there's something terribly wrong in how we are responding and dealing with this issue. And in terms of climate disruption, as people gather throughout this country on Sunday to try to demonstrate the need to ameliorate the climate degradation that's happening, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with a subtitle, "The Worst Is Yet to Come," predicted that violent conflict would increase over land, over water, over decreasing resources. And indeed, in the conflicts that we're involved in, we can point to that as a key factor in each of those conflicts. So, let me do a quick taxonomy. And since I'm in a college environment, I get to use the word taxonomy. To break down that there's different applications of nonviolent methods. You'll hear this evening from Erica about civil uprisings, about nonviolent, organized, disciplined strategies that have been used to disrupt, to change the status quo. We most often think about nonviolence about this application. The U.S. Civil Rights Movement, Solidarity in Poland, most of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. We think of this when we think Arab Spring, when we think about nonviolence. But there's also the organized application of nonviolence to support the status quo. This developed primarily in the 1980s during the tail end of the Cold War, where countries and civilians were developing civilian-based nonviolent defense of their country, based upon nonviolent activities and strategies. But what I'm going to be talking about is active strategic nonviolence used to protect civilians and to prevent violence, or what's come to be known as unarmed civilian peacekeeping. So what is unarmed civilian peacekeeping? It's a very narrow niche when it comes down to it. It's well-trained, unarmed civilians who are providing direct protection to other civilians who are under threat of physical violence. It's providing support to local civil society to help them protect themselves and reduce violence, and strengthening the capacity of existing protection mechanisms to protect civilians. So we're based upon key principles. Those principles include nonviolence. We are only nonviolent. We will not resort nor accept military support. We all carry actually ID cards in our wallets that say that. One of our principles is the primacy of local actors. We only go at the invitation of local groups, and we are not there to bring our agenda. We are there to help create or protect the space so that local actors can act on what they think needs to be done to solve the conflict and stay alive. We are totally nonpartisan. We don't go in to take sides. We are there to protect civilians. We are independent, and we are civilian to civilian, not nation state to nation state. And that changes the dynamics quite dramatically. Our key methodologies that I'll get into in a few minutes include proactive engagement, monitoring, relationship building, capacity building. And even though we are nonpartisan, that doesn't mean that we don't believe in anything. We're guided by things like international humanitarian law, refugee law, human rights law, UN resolutions on women, peace, and security, on grave child rights violations, on culture of peace and nonviolence, and others. So our peacekeepers are multinational. Right now, we have about 200 people in the field, and they come from 25 different countries. They're intergender. We have now 43% of our peacekeepers in the field are women. That's not high enough, but if you compare that to the armed peacekeepers that are fielded by the UN, where they have 3% are women. Our peacekeepers are specially trained and they're full-time professionals. They go through extensive training and then they are paid. This is a paid job. They receive their room and board, their transportation, all their expenses in the field, plus starting out about $1,500 per month that they cannot spend on site because we're in very fragile areas and that can blow out local economies. We live in the community, we're nonviolent, we're neutral, we're strategic, we can move quickly, and we're cost-effective. For us to recruit, train, field, and pay one unarmed civilian peacekeeper, it costs us a little under $50,000 per year. For those of us in this room who are paying our taxes in the United States, we currently are paying $2 million per soldier in Afghanistan per year. So we're the fiscal conservatives. This gives you another look. I talked about proactive engagement, monitoring, capacity building, and relationship building. And from that, there's a variety of methods that are applied that do protect civilians, and I'll go quickly into some examples of that. The most well-known example of unarmed civilian peacekeeping is protective accompaniment, where a person will be placed with someone who is under threat because of the work that they do. In this situation, this was in Guatemala, where Claudia was and still heads a women's human rights organization. Her group had become under direct great threat because they were starting to uncover information about the genocide in Guatemala that was implicating political candidates. So their office was broken into, identification materials taken, a noose was left hanging from the door handle, and then people, each of the women were called and a funeral dirge played on their cell phones. So in this case, we were able to send a group to provide accompaniment. So you see Betsy merely watching Claudia's back. It's not a very romantic job. In fact, it got a little boring. We weren't there to be involved in gathering information. We were merely there so that Claudia would have more comfort and security to do her work and to stay alive. This may look mundane. Well, I mean, what's dangerous about that? Before we got there, one of Claudia's colleagues had gone to eat in a cafe at noontime and had been shot 26 times. The police termed it a robbery. We also provide accompaniment right now in South Sudan, where there was a reignition of a civil war last December, and that has caused 1 million people to be displaced. 1 million people. Think about what Jan Eglund said in terms of the average time of displacement. What's happened is thousands of people have crowded into protection of civilian areas. We don't call them camps because that dignifies it too much. It's people crammed together for some semblance of security. When the women go out to collect firewood, to collect water, to grind sorghum, there were groups of armed soldiers waiting and would gang rape them. What we found is that if there were one or two of our people simply with the women when they went, in this case for water, this is Tiago from Brazil, that if we're there invisible, the soldiers left them alone. So a pretty small price to pay for security. There has to be that visibility, though. When we were in Sri Lanka, there was an instance one morning where a group of mothers came to our team, and their sons had been kidnapped the night before to be forced to become child soldiers. There are over 300,000 child soldiers today in the world. These moms had had enough. They wanted to go after their kids. So we helped the mothers to find where the young men were being held in the jungle, and then accompanied them to the camp. And when they got there, they were confronted by two young commanders, two young guys in their 20s, who had been child soldiers themselves. Not a lot older than some of you guys sitting here. And they saw these moms and they said, "You go away. This is no longer your matter." Can you imagine telling a mom whose kids have been kidnapped the night before, "This is no longer your matter"? Well, the moms stayed. And they were supported by, it was just 6 of us. 6 of us from a variety of countries around the world. And the young commanders knew enough that this was over their pay grade. So they called for their superiors who came out. And because we never go anywhere without first establishing communication and relationships with all of the armed actors. So in this case, it was the Tamil Tigers. They knew who we were, and negotiations took place, and over about a day and a half, the 26 boys were returned home. This turned into routine accompaniment with moms to retrieve their children, and then to protective presence in areas where the children were being abducted so that they were not abducted, and then finally to the mothers organizing against the practice of child soldiers altogether. Another example of accompaniment Kathleen, who's here, where are you, Kathleen? Kathleen and I were speaking at the UN in March. And when we were done, this woman, who we didn't know, got up and said, "My name is Zina Blandia. I'm from the Nuba Mountains. And in 2012, I walked into South Sudan and I was arrested. I'm a human rights defender. And I was moved around to very remote jails, and I was sure I was going to be killed. But somehow, Nonviolent Peaceforce found where I was, and along with some staff from the UN, found me and got me out and saved my life." She's now working at the UN, really with no money at all, trying to bring the story of the people of Nuba Mountains in Sudan to the attention of diplomats. We also provide child protection for children. This is a scene from South Sudan where there are thousands of unaccompanied minors who show up in these camps in other areas for internally displaced people. And they are then easy pickings for various armed groups to kidnap, either for porters, for soldiers, for sex slaves. And so we find if there's just a couple of us staying with the children, the armed groups leave them alone. We also then work very quickly to try to find relatives in the nearby area who can take the children. Often these children's parents have been killed en route. Now, I wanted to tell this story when the young man said, "Well, if there's people shooting at you, what are you going to do?" This is a case that happened in April, where two of our peacekeepers, Derek and Andreas. Derek is from the United Kingdom, Andreas is from Mexico. And they were in one of those protection of civilian areas in South Sudan that I told you about. You can see thousands, in this case hundreds of people crammed together. Derek and Andreas were with a group of 14 women and children. The fence was climbed by young men of a rival militia with brand new AK-47s. Always keep in mind, those young men didn't create those AK-47s. Somebody got rich off of selling those AK-47s that wound up in those young men's hands. So they came forward and started shooting people point blank. Derek and Andreas took the 14 women and children that they were with into a hut and stood in the doorway. On 3 occasions, armed militia, guys 20, 21 years old, came to Derek and Andreas and said, "You have to go, we want those people." All 3 times, they held up their Nonviolent Peaceforce cards. They said, "We are unarmed, we are here to protect civilians, and we will not leave." After the 3rd time, the militia left, and the people were spared. I recommend there's an interview of them on our website. They believe very strongly that if they would have been armed, they would have been killed. They would have been shot right away. Interpositioning is another method that we use, where at times we will place ourselves between 2 conflicting parties. We never do that. We don't walk into the middle of a war and say, "Okay, stop." That's all based upon prior relationships and communications. In this case, in Mindanao. Anybody ever heard of Mindanao? A few of you, all right. Mindanao is the largest island in the southern Philippines. It historically has been inhabited by the Moro people. The Moro people who have been Muslim for many centuries. They never saw themselves as part of the Philippines. That was a decision that was made by colonial cartographers. So they have been fighting for various degrees of independence and home rule for many years. This was a situation where in this village that you see, there were 2 armed groups, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front on one side and the Armed Forces of the Philippines on the other side, were approaching this village. People started to panic. started to pack up. They were going to flee. In this case, the elders called our team that was close by and said, you know, is there anything you can do? Our people are starting to leave. So our teams went to the village, and en route, and in this modern day, you have people on speed dial. They called the commander of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and then the commander of the Armed Forces of the Philippines and said, you know, there must be some mistake. Your guys are converging on this village. They were within 500 meters. People are starting to flee. 1,000 people are going to leave. We know you don't want that to happen. And so to make sure it doesn't happen, our team is going to go and stay in the village until your guys back off. They backed off, and 1,000 people stayed home. That demonstrates one of the reasons why nonpartisanship is so important and why communication, to be able to communicate with all of the armed actors, is important. We also use early warning, early response, where we work with communities to identify. People know, well, there's something going on, there's something amiss, but they often don't systematize that in any way. So we help communities to put together early warning indicators so they know when there is trouble brewing, and then early responses, usually going with a mix of local inter-ethnic groups along with the support of internationals to the place, to the flashpoint to quell the violence. This was a situation in South Sudan where two of our peacekeepers, Abraham, who is from South Sudan, and half of our peacekeepers come from the host country, and Asha Ashokan, who is from southern India. And the local people sounded the warning late one afternoon that fighting had started between two rival clans. And so Asha and Abraham were part of a team that responded. And when they got there, the fighting had started. And one of the young warriors turned to Abraham. And as you can see, there's a bit of a height differential here. Turned to Abraham, and these are Dinka people who tend to be very tall. And the guy amidst the battle said, "Who's the small girl?" And Abraham said, "Why, that's Asha Ashokan." "Well, where's she from?" "Well, she's from India." "Well, why is she here?" "Well, she's here to get you to quit fighting." And this young man said, "If someone cares that much to come that far to get us to quit, we'll stop." And he called his men off, and they retreated. Now that's a moment. That's not sustainable peace building. But in violent conflicts, moments are extremely important. That gave us a chance to convene the rival chiefs, to sit together, and through the night, work out a resolution so this group never went back to fighting. In fact, Asha tells the story of running into one of the women from the community just a couple of months ago. This happened a year ago, April. And the woman saying, "You know, we never went back to fighting." Also, a matter of training and capacity building, working with local communities for their own protective mechanisms. This is again an example from South Sudan. From an area when our team showed up, they asked if there could be a community security meeting. And there was, and it was only men who came. And so this is a woman by the name of Lisa, who's from the US. And Lisa said, "Well, where are the women?" And Lisa was told, "Well, this is men's work. This is not women's work." So they listened, and after the meeting, they asked around who were the women leaders. And every community has women leaders, and every community has women who are good organizers. They quickly found a woman named Mary. And they talked to her, and Mary said, "You name the time and place, I'll show up with the women." She came walking up the road in this patriarchal society with 80 women. And they sat around in a big circle. And they talked about how that in this small village, there were 17 reported rapes per month. Reported. Now, rapes are underreported everywhere, but in this case, very underreported. And it was at the hands of soldiers. And so what they ended up doing with the women was, number one, to set up a phone tree. Do you know what a phone tree is? And not every woman had a cell phone, but there's a cellular tower close by, and every woman was within a 500-meter walk of someone who did. So they just set up a little chart. So if there was danger, if there was a soldier, usually drunk, lurking, they would activate the phone tree, a group would go, and to help that soldier be on his way. The other thing was that we set up routine patrols. Was it something I said? No, I know you guys got to go to class. Thanks for being here. Oh my goodness. So an excuse for those of you who don't have class to leave also, because I won't. But the other thing that was done was just routine patrols, where in the morning there were armed peacekeepers there from the UN. They would do a patrol in the morning. There was a small police unit there that would do a patrol in the afternoon. These would take about an hour and a half, and then we would do, as the only unarmed group, we would do the patrol in the evening. Within 6 weeks, the rapes had stopped. This is just good organizing. People coming together and saying, yeah, I can make a difference here. Another example will move, well, let me just give one more example. We have been in Mindanao for a little over 7 years. In 2008, a violent conflict broke out where 600,000 people were displaced, and the fighting was intense. We stayed on. By the end of 2009, there was a ceasefire that was signed between the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the government of the Philippines. And we were asked to be part of that ceasefire agreement as a non-governmental organization. And we were given responsibility for civilian protection. So for the next 4 years, we had 9 teams throughout the island that were reporting daily on breaches of civilian protection. More importantly, we trained 300 local people on how to do the monitoring, how to do the verification and the reporting. So that spread the reach of this ceasefire deep into the grassroots. It also spread ownership. People started to feel they were a part of it. That has led to a comprehensive peace agreement that was signed, well, I'll get to that in a minute, that was signed in March. And now they're looking at how to implement what will be a semi-autonomous Moro sub-state in the southern Philippines. And I put this in here just to give you a little insight. We always hear about these Islamic terrorists and jihadists and so on. These are members of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And a couple of years ago, I was traveling with a team from public television who did a story on unarmed peacekeeping in the Philippines. And we were in our vehicle, the red one that you see back there. It was late in the afternoon, and we came into this village, and we saw people coming out of the hills with their things on their backs, with wheelbarrows, with bicycles loaded up. That's never a good sign. And then we came into town, and here were a couple hundred young combatants mustering for a skirmish. And so our security guy who was driving the vehicle, and he had Fred D. Sam Lazaro, who used to be based here, and a crew from public television. And so the security guy was saying to the driver, just keep going, just keep going. Of course, the media guys were saying, stop this vehicle, stop it now. Well, you see who won. And so here's Tom videoing these vicious combatants. And look at what they're doing. They're taking pictures of this guy, taking pictures of them. So that has led to a peace agreement. This civilian-based ceasefire monitoring is a model now that is being implemented in Myanmar, where we have a team that's working there where there's not one ceasefire, but 14 ceasefires. It's a very fragile situation. So does this work? You can listen to stories from me, but we've also started to do quantitative impact assessment to really measure. In this case, we compared villages in Mindanao where there was an NP presence to where there was no presence. And these findings are statistically significant. People reported feeling safer and more secure in places where the unarmed peacekeepers were present. Most importantly, they reported a greater community capacity to respond to threats of violence themselves. And finally, a greater awareness of the peace process. In an external evaluation that was just done a couple of months ago, the evaluators found that armed actors on both sides confirmed that the presence of a third party watching over them, including NP, has served to temper their behavior. It does work, one child at a time. This was a return of a child who had been abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army. Some of you may have followed that with Joseph Kony. Anybody see Hotel Rwanda? So some of you. It's worth seeing. A hotel manager in Rwanda during the genocide, played by Don Cheadle, through guile, through courage, through manipulation, saved 1,100 people just in his hotel. That part was played by Don Cheadle, who played the real guy, Paul Rusesabagina. Paul is one of our supporters. He believes very strongly that if there would have just been a handful, a couple of hundred unarmed peacekeepers in Rwanda during that period, it would have made a huge difference in terms of the genocide that happened 20 years ago last April. So why does it work? Why do well-armed, and this came up, why would well-armed guys with AK-47s care about a bunch of people from around the world with vests that say Nonviolent Peaceforce? So we have studied this, and we found a number of reasons. First of all, most of the armed actors, whether they be non-state actors or state actors, have a chain of command. Usually, at what we do on the international level is to try to put pressure on the decision makers. We do this through sanctions, the UN, the US, but also groups like Amnesty International. Primarily focuses on the decision makers, and maybe a little bit down the chain of command. But they've become very good at deflecting that pressure. So for example, when we were in Sri Lanka, where massive civil rights abuses were going on, human rights abuses, the government of Sri Lanka was being represented in Washington by one of the largest lobby firms, Patton Boggs. Look them up online. The principal, Tommy Boggs, his parents, both of them, were in the State House, or the U.S. Congress. His sister's a woman named Cokie Roberts, who you may see on television or hear on the radio. So these guys are very good. The human rights offenders are very good at deflecting that criticism. They're also very good about saying, it's not really me. I wish I had $1 for every time meeting with a combatant group that'd say, oh, we're so glad you're here because it's those SOBs. Well, all right, we'll accept that. We're here. So our job is to be on the ground in the areas where the violence is happening. To first of all, supply information to the international level, but as we see that can get deflected, but also to understand the vulnerability points down the chain of command and to address those vulnerability points. What we find is even at this level, people are very concerned today, armed actors, about international tribunals and the International Criminal Court. And having people like Asha, who happens to be an international human rights lawyer, they're concerned that that person may show up in a tribunal in a few years and testify. Down the line, it could be religious considerations, social considerations. It's up to us to know what those are so that we can block the violence against targeted civilians. So this is the deterrence part of it. But there's also an encouragement part of it. We only go at the request of local civil society, and what we find is that those local groups tend to be enhanced. Their reputation, more people are interested. This was a group in Mindanao, a women's human rights group, meeting with our team, and it tends to draw more interest and credibility for those local groups. We model nonviolence, which also inspires nonviolence in other people. And there's a lot of scientific work that's being done about mirror neurons right now. Pay attention to this work being done on mirror neurons. But socially, remember me telling you about those mothers who went to the camps to get their kids back? This is them a couple of years later. Moving and playing an important role in the elimination of the abduction of children in Sri Lanka. We also offer the power of presence. This is the least understood, but also is being studied. It's a very mutual kind of interaction. It's sharing with no particular power, with people who are in great struggle. And they share with us and enhance and provide protection for our people as well. This happened during the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. This is a photo I love from Selma in 1965, where we see Dr. King, of course. Here's young John Lewis, the congressman who's now 70 years old, from Atlanta. A woman religious who I tried to find her name. I mean, that's part of the story, right? Many of the women who have been so important go nameless. But I also point out Rabbi Heschel, providing that protective presence. Heschel, during that time, bridging between especially the Jewish communities and the African American communities, would say, "My prayer is my feet." Presence. Making space for people to stop and think and feel beyond violence. It's our most fundamental resource. So remember that ordinary people have come together and made dramatic changes in this world. Now, we could go through this list and put an asterisk next to each one of them. Say abolition, yeah, but look at human trafficking today, look at Mauritania. But we can say that slavery is very different than it was 200 years ago in this world. And that's because ordinary people came together and organized and worked and resisted. And we'll hear a lot more about that this evening. But I recommend the book Bury the Chains, about the British abolition movement. Bury the Chains. The anti-apartheid movement. The whole elevation of human rights. Restriction on child labor. The rapid spread of anti-colonialism. And of course there's neo-colonialism. It's not saying that everything's perfect, but there has been change. The ban on atmospheric nuclear testing. Successive waves of democracy. These things have come about because of ordinary people. Co-creating. The multiverse, and I changed this because I went to a lecture last week at the Museum of Natural History on the growing evidence of multiverses as opposed to universes that we're living in. It's pretty exciting just to go outside and think about. But it's creating all the time. We are immersed in that creation. So seek what is serving to emerge. Is that universe friendly? Dr. King thought so. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And this is a long quote, and you shouldn't use those in PowerPoints, but I love it. Where Gandhi said, "I do dimly perceive that whilst all around me is ever changing, ever dying, there is the underlying all, that change, a living power that changes not, that holds all together, that creates, dissolves, and recreates. And is this power malevolent or benevolent? I see it as purely benevolent. For I do see in the midst of death, life persists. So ordinary people can be involved in bringing about change. Ordinary people can be involved to make sure and stop human trafficking, to stop the apartheid, for example, that takes place in Israel and Palestine, to further human rights, but also to put an end to war. This can happen during your lifetime. And for those of us my age and older, or for any of us, Isidore Stone, the old journalist, used to say, if you expect to see the answers to your questions in your lifetime, you're not asking big enough questions. So what can you do to help? As Frida interned with us this summer. We rely on interns. I have an intern in New York working with me at the UN. We have interns in our Brussels office. We rely on interns and volunteers. We need money. You know, Dr. King said those of us working for peace have to be as well organized and committed as those who are working for war. And so this does cost money. If St. Ben's and St. John's could adopt a peacekeeper, now maybe you can't raise $50,000, but maybe you could adopt a peacekeeper for a month and sponsor them and build a relationship. Start a center for nonviolent strategies. Have a retreat place for nonviolent strategists from around the world to come together once a year and to really challenge each other and look at how we can respond nonviolently and creatively. Become an unarmed civilian peacekeeper. We recruit often. Look at our website. Now, there's a minimum age of 25, but get a little experience and then apply when you're 25. And most importantly, talk, tweet, Facebook about alternatives. Spark yours and your friends' moral imaginations. And I leave you with this. Again, going back to Abraham Joshua Heschel. Our goal should be to live life in radical amazement. To get up in the morning and look at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted. Everything is phenomenal. Everything is incredible. Never treat life casually. And I love this line. To be spiritual is to be amazed. To be amazed even in these very dark and troubled times. To trust yourself and who you are meant to be. And then have the courage to act on that. So I thank you for this time and this attention this afternoon. And we have
time for questions.
Yes,
I don't know
we
if
have.
we need the microphone or.
Does this microphone work? Hello?
We may be able to do without it.
All right. Let's have questions.
How many peacekeepers do you currently have?
Right now we have another class that's coming in for South Sudan, so it'll be about 230. And we're in Mindanao. Our largest team is in South Sudan. We have a team in Myanmar. Today we have an exploratory team in the Ukraine. And we are working with a group of Syrian civil society groups to try to get funding for a peacekeeping project there. Yeah.
I've heard it said over and over again that when you deal with people in ISIS, you are dealing with irrational people who are so radicalized that they can't respond to the rational. Would there be anything different in the training of your peacekeeping to deal with such a mentality? And this is what I hear. I don't know the inner workings of what you know, but how would you give an additional dimension to your training, or what are you doing in this area?
Well, we always seek to try to understand all the combatants. And so if we were in an area with ISIS, it would be to understand them. Part of our training basis is based on empathy. On empathy. And that includes empathy for ISIS. I say that, knowing they cut the head off of one of my colleagues 3 days ago. But we have to understand them. And we have to understand everyone that's coming together. Now, we don't say this works in every situation. So part of our work is to analyze the conflict very carefully and the vulnerability points for the various armed actors. And there's sometimes we have an international board of directors, and they look very carefully at those reports before they give us a green light to go ahead. And so we aren't saying this works in every situation, but we'll at least explore it and start to engage. Yes?
Have you had any casualties among your people that
We've been in the field for 3 years, and we've had 3 people injured with conflict. One fellow, retired Serbian judge who was working with us, and unfortunately went the wrong direction when a hand grenade was thrown and got hit with shrapnel in his behind. Which, if you're going to get hit with shrapnel, that's where to get hit. And so he had minor surgery and was back. Another person was in a container, you know, those large containers in South Sudan, and a stray bullet came through the wall and hit him in the leg. And then most seriously, one of our peacekeepers in 2009 was kidnapped and held for 111 days. And he was injured during that kidnapping. But that, going back to your question, I can say now, the kidnappers were Abu Sayyaf, you know, a very radical Islamist group. And sometimes they would call, and they would talk for an hour and a half. That wasn't about ransom, that was about recognition. We were talking with people who were deeply heartbroken. Now, I abhor what they were doing. But to understand was very important in terms of getting eventually getting the release of Jalil, and without armed intervention. So we've had those 3. We have very strict security protocol. Our security officer is a former officer in the Irish Navy who had been a UN armed peacekeeper and has been an unarmed peacekeeper. So he understands the field pretty well, and he's tough. And if you don't adhere to our security protocol, you go home. You know, this isn't something where you just go out and do what you feel like. This is very disciplined. And so while we take risk, it is informed and strategic risk. And there have been times, a handful, where we've had to pull people out of a particular area. Never out of a country, but out of a particular area, because they couldn't protect themselves anymore. In all cases except for one, those people were able to return. Yeah?
Do you see the connection here? Is there a relationship that you've been exploring at the UN in terms of responsibility to protect? Were you there for the Pillar 2 meeting that was just taking place at the UN? Is that why you were up there for that?
I wasn't there for that particular meeting on Pillar 2. Responsibility to protect. It is a very complex norm. Basically, have people studied what's euphemistically called R2P?
Give a brief.
Okay. So, responsibility to protect really came up because of the genocide in Rwanda and the killings in Srebrenica. And a international panel really emanating from Canada put together a series of procedures that came under the social norm of R2P, responsibility to protect. It only applies to 4 crimes of genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and forget the 4th, but 4 grave violations. So it doesn't...
Use of chemical weapons?
No. There are very serious genocide-like crimes for R2P to be employed. Then secondly, in terms of the pillars, there's 3 pillars, as you say. The first one is that, and it's all based on the premise that sovereignty equals responsibility. And so countries have a responsibility to protect all of their citizens. So the first pillar is that countries protect their own civilians. If there's a grave violation, that they'll muster the resources and they'll protect their own civilians. If that doesn't happen, pillar 2 is to bring together voluntarily various resources from around the world to help them help protect their civilians. And then pillar 3 is if the sovereign government will not or cannot protect their civilians, then the Security Council of the UN, only the Security Council of the UN, can act to protect those civilians. And there's an array of things that come under Article 7, the most extreme of which is military intervention. Unfortunately, when that was applied in Libya a couple of years ago, it was clearly done for regime change, not for protection of civilians. And they went from 1 to 3.9 very quickly in terms of sending in the fighters. And you see what a mess we have today. Many people at the UN say that that action assassinated R2P, that the Security Council probably will not invoke it again because they claim it was bait and switch. Countries were told it was to protect civilians, it was to get rid of Gaddafi. I don't believe it was bait and switch. I think everybody wanted to get Gaddafi and it just gave them their cover. So I find especially the military interventions to really at times just be another tool of imperialism or just war. But there are nonviolent, and this is our position that we say, you know, you could send in unarmed civilian peacekeepers to protect civilians. That could be done under either Article 6 or Article 7 of the UN. And it would be possible to do that. But the use of armed force, I think, is troublesome, but certainly would be better than what's being decided in Congress this afternoon.
Yeah, but it was successfully used in Kenya in 2000.
Yes, good, yes. That's a fair comeback. And you're right, and it probably did save a number of people. But it wasn't really a huge invasion and fighter jets. It was Kofi Annan and a lot of other people coming together to assist in stopping killings that could have been tens of thousands. You're exactly right.
But there was the threat of military intervention.
That was there.
Yeah.
You're right. You're right. We have time for a couple more questions. Yeah.
What is your budget? How are you supported by any government support?
Get the envelopes out, Kathleen. Our budget this year, and this amazes me to say, will be about $6.5 million. And it amazes me because I remember when we were funding this by maxing out our personal credit cards. It wasn't that many years ago. In fact, I remember having my credit card refused. 2/3 of our money come from large institutions. Our largest funders right now include UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, and the UN High Commission on Refugees. We also get funding from the European Union. That proposal I told you about that we're working with Syrian civil society, we just turned in a grant on Monday to the European Union for that. We also get money from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, sometimes from the British, sometimes the Spanish and the Australians. Sometimes the Catalonians have given us funding because they, of course, have their own foreign policy. And then 1/3 of our money comes from individuals. And that we rely upon heavily because it really gives us our rudder to keep us true, that no one can pull our strings too much because we have a couple of thousand individual donors and we survive on that. So we need your money. I mean, I gotta be unabashed. We need your money to keep this going. And contributions are tax deductible. And believe me, $5 from somebody who can afford $5 is as important as 5,000. So please give.
The U.S. government provide any funding?
We have, in the past, gotten a couple of grants from the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is a quasi-federal organization that was established by Congress. They funded our initial curriculum development. They funded the startup of a project in South Sudan in a state they were interested in. Indirectly, there were a few disaster funds that came as part of a package that we got in South Sudan once, but there's never been any kind of major funding from the U.S. government. We haven't given up on our government.
Do you solicit?
Yes, we certainly have met with various agencies in the State Department and USAID, and we'll continue to do that. They haven't been real excited about nonviolent peacekeeping.
I'm going to ask another question, if I may. You're working with moderate Syrian opposition?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay. So who are you working with? Because we get this, we're getting this push that there's no one in the opposition in Syria except Islamic jihadists, right?
No, I don't agree with that. I was in Syria last year and did spend time in opposition areas. And there are some, I don't know the right adjectives to use. There are some who are more secular and who are not jihadists. And they're substantial, but there's 1,000 different militia groups amid the opposition. I mean, you can go, a couple kilometers and get stopped by one group and shaken down, and you go a couple more and it's a totally different group, and they're controlling little pieces of land and killing lots of people over it, fighting amongst each other when they're not fighting Assad. And we are working with unarmed civil society. We're working with those groups who are committed to a peaceful, pluralistic Syrian future. And it's a group that includes those non-governmental organizations that are in opposition to the government, those who are neutral, and those who support the government. And there are non-governmental groups that are there that are supporting the government. Now, when I was there and talking with people, in Damascus, we would get a strong defense of the government and how they were fighting terrorists and so on and so forth. When we talk to people privately, they'd say, hey, we never loved Assad. We know the kind of oppressive conditions we've had to live in. But what do you think our chances are with the Islamists? This primarily came from Christian people, Shia people, and Alawite people. That they just see it as a battle for existence. And that there's no good choice there. So let's take one last question. From someone okay, yes, good.
I'm really interested in, I know you said you only go someplace once you're invited, but how do those people find out about you? Like, what do you do to get your presence known? But then more importantly, how do you said you're looking at different countries, but how do you, and you said there's an advisory board kind of, how do you pick those, and then how do you make yourselves known to those countries?
Wow, okay. How do we make ourselves known? First of all, in this world with the internet, we are known. Secondly, we do have 40 member organizations who support us that are located around the world in various regions, and they put out the word about us, and they'll identify conflicts and come back to us and say, this looks like it might be someplace to consider, and contact these people. We work with them. We've been doing that in Syria with a Lebanese group that's been close to us since our founding. Then we have, we go through a number of initial criteria. We just did this with the Ukraine. And then we have a feasibility study that we did, and we've developed 25 criteria that we look at as to whether we have a reasonable chance of protecting civilians in this area. So that team that's in the Ukraine right now, they'll come back with a report, give that to our board. If the board thinks, yeah, this is worth further exploration, then we'll send a team that will spend 3-6 months meeting with all the various combatant groups, meeting with civil society, with government, with internationals that are there, and looking at those 25 criteria. Then they'll bring back that report to the board, and then the board will make a decision as to whether we can go or not. So it's a complex procedure. It's not just that we get an invitation and go. Well, thank you for this engagement.